Hello and welcome to Your Favorite Book. I'm Tanner.
I'm Mallory.
I'm Dustin.
We're a family.
And we like books.
And on today's episode, we have a very special guest, our dad, Dustin Hanson, who wanted us to read Salem's Lot for the October Vampire Readathon, which is the second book in our Readathon.
Oh, yeah.
Salem's Lot is a book for old people. That's all I have to say about it today.
Yeah, we're really swinging both sides of the spectrum here to go from Twilight to Salem's Lot.
Oh, yeah. Very different
The
books.
emotional whiplash between the two of these is a little overwhelming.
Yeah. Both books have missed me as the target audience because I'm like right in the middle. No. I think Salem's Lot is an adult book, but I only say that it's for old people because it reads like a dated book.
Mm-hmm.
It was published in 1970-something.
75,
which is around the time. When did you first read this book?
I thought that I'd read it earlier, and I thought about it more. So I know the first Stephen King book I read was It. That was the first one I read.
And how
so I
old were
looked
you?
up the dates. So that was actually in 86, so I was 16.
Oh,
so
wow.
much older than I thought. And I remember, I was in the office at my high school. A good friend of mine named Chip Winch had a copy of It, and we were both, some reason standing at the desk. I remember this like it was yesterday.
Uh-huh.
And he's like, oh, you got to read this, you got to read this. And so Chip lent me that book. My mom saw me reading it, and she's like, oh, I've read this other one. And she had a copy of Salem's Lot. So I read those two back to back.
Okay.
Probably, nonstop until I finished them.
Right.
So yeah, I was older than I thought. Initially, I thought I was younger than that, but
Right.
So 16.
Okay, cool. That feels pretty on target for
I think it
Stephen
seems
King
a little
book.
young. It seems
Really?
a little young to me.
Well, I think when Stephen King came out, he was pretty popular, right?
Yeah.
And maybe it was
Overnight, he was popular.
it would be cool for a younger kid to
Oh,
read a
okay,
Stephen
yeah,
King
yeah,
book.
that
So it's
makes
like
sense.
watching an R-rated movie. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
postulating. I have
Yeah.
no idea what it was like.
Oh, for sure. Well, I mean, I grew up in rural Utah, super hyper conservative, in a religion that wouldn't allow you to watch a rated R movie, and so to read a rated R book would have been pretty taboo.
Mm-hmm.
My parents were pretty open about that stuff, and my mom kind of let me read anything I want, kind of like Stephen King mentions in his prologue of this book.
Mm-hmm.
So I had read other books that were similar, scary. I'd read Bram Stoker's Dracula before then, etc.
Yeah.
And I'd read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and I'd read a lot of comic books.
Yeah.
So I was already kind of in that dark mode. This was
Yeah.
just the first King book, and for me, I'm a dyslexic kid. Reading a big book was tough. So having somebody pass me It, which was like 800 pages, and getting through it, and then picking up Salem's Lot, which is probably, 600?
600,
so.
yeah.
600 pages.
Yeah.
It was a big deal for me to read a book that big.
Yeah.
It was huge.
That's great. Well, it sounds like you were kind of primed for Stephen King beforehand.
Yeah.
I was kind of the
Had a
same
good
way
ramp
with
up.
Brandon Sanderson's stuff, where it's like you start with Harry Potter, just like baby's first fantasy. It's a
Yeah.
moral fantasy.
Yeah.
And then you upgrade or you level up to get to like the more adult stuff,
Yeah.
where it's like they pace out their story way differently. The content itself is much more high stakes and scarier. The tone is much darker. So it's a natural progression when you put it that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, we've reread a couple of our old favorite books. Like, when we reread Aragon, we were like, ooh, I remember loving this. And now coming back with more mature tastes, and you've read more books out there, and you can really see, like, oh, I'm glad I read it when I did, because I could really enjoy it as a younger audience, working my way up into these more high-stakes fantasies. But when you go back to that, you're kind of like, oh,
It's not as good as I remember.
Yeah.
That's interesting because, I haven't read Salem's Lot. I know I read it, like I said, in 86, and then I read it one time in between, and reading it this time, it held up very well to me.
Oh, I did too. I really enjoyed it.
So, even the pace and everything, but I think that was kind of hearkening back to, these are the books I loved. And sometimes now, books I read now, I feel like they get to the pace faster, and I don't have time to, love and understand a character as much as I did. Stephen King makes you fall in love with characters before he hurts them.
Yeah.
And I like that. But that's probably, like I said, an old man's book, right? That's my pace. That's what I like.
Right. Well, 16 is a very formative time in your life, And usually when you find something that you love at that age, I would say you look for that thing for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
And if you know It, have you read It?
I haven't.
I've watched the movie.
You've seen the movie?
Yeah, I've
okay,
seen the
well,
movies.
at least, okay, so both It and Salem's Lot kind of spoke to me because of where I grew up.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I grew up in a super small town.
Yeah.
Everyone rode their bikes everywhere. You didn't come home until it was dark. Like, that was the curfew. And you knew everybody's name and all their business. And that's what both those books feel like.
Yeah.
You know, Salem's Lot in particular feels like small town mid-Americana.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. And that's where his skill as a world builder and a character writer comes into play, because the first half of this book, to me, while I was listening to it, feels like almost an anthology. Like, it jumps from perspective to perspective. Just to give people an idea of what this book is about, it's a vampire story. If you've seen something like Midnight Mass, for younger audiences who haven't read Salem's Lot or haven't read Stephen King, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Midnight Mass is a really good comparison to this book, I would say.
I think so too.
Matter of fact, I think it's influenced by.
I think so too.
I think it has to be. There's no way it isn't.
Even if you remember the very, very first opening of Midnight Mass is him.
Bringing in.
No. It's the main character who could be a stand-in for Ben Mears.
Mm-hmm.
Sitting on the side of the road, seeing that he's caused an accident and somebody's died.
That's right.
I felt like while I was reading this book, I love Midnight Mass. It's one of my favorite things ever.
Mm-hmm. Was it Mike Flanagan? Is that
yeah,
the
Mike
director,
Flanagan.
right?
Yeah.
The basic premise of both of those books is a vampire invades a small town and the characters have to kill it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like a monster hunter story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The third act of the book is like where they actually kill the monster happens. Spoilers for this book, by the way. But in Midnight Mass, like in Salem's Lot, the first couple acts are really slow because it's just showing you what this town is like.
And what the stasis is, so that we can see the change from that. I also think both Midnight Mass and Salem's Lot both have a lot of fantastic religious questions brought up. Both of these small towns are also fairly religious, and that's a very important aspect in both the culture of the town and the culture of the vampires that Stephen King sets up, too.
Yeah, in Midnight Mass, I feel like that point is emphasized more strongly, and that spoke to me when I was watching the show. In Salem's Lot, there's a lot of religious iconography. There's obviously a lot of hidden meaning that I didn't pick up on, probably because I just need more time to think about the book and what actually happens in it. I felt like there was a lot more hidden meaning, and maybe there was some messaging about religious beliefs or like immortality or like good versus evil, stuff like that. In Midnight Mass, I feel like those messages were portrayed more strongly. And I'm not going to spend the whole episode comparing the two, but they are very similar.
Yeah.
They are.
In Salem's Lot, there is a lot of cool world building with like all of the mythologies of the vampires are real.
Yeah.
And it's about these characters trying to convince each other of like, is it a real vampire? And if it is, then do we need garlic?
Yeah. That was a fun.
Do we need to make steaks to kill it?
Yeah.
And those myths turn out to be true and actually helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those conversations towards the end of the book where it's like you have one of these main characters, Matt, right, who's an English teacher. He kind of becomes your Matt Burke. He kind of becomes your Van Helsing character. They even mention it in the book.
I know.
Yep.
I kind of wish that he didn't.
There's a lot of like, just like Dracula.
Yeah.
And you're like, we can make that comparison as an audience without you having to spell that out.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like that kind of supported the world building, like him wearing his influences on his sleeve.
That is true.
Because someone like Ben Mears would absolutely know about Bram Stoker's Dracula or Van Helsing, and he would make that comparison if he was experiencing that in real life.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Even though it is Jimmy who makes this, I guess Ben asked him, does he remind you of anyone? And Jimmy's like, yeah, Van Helsing. So I'm like, Doctor had time to read Van Helsing? But
right.
Can I say
Part
something
of his
too?
thesis.
Yeah. When you mentioned the first part of the book feels like an anthology.
Yeah.
So this is theory of one, right? This is just my theory, is that I think that's a very intentional thing. And Stephen King quite often puts himself as an insert character as the author in a book, or at least that's, kind of a theory. A lot of his books have authors at the center of the book. And the first part of the book is really kind of him this is, if you've watched the HBO movie that just came out, or Max movie that just came out, they do not deliver this. But in the book, he doesn't tell anybody about what he's doing for so long, but he brings the audience along by providing research into pieces of the town.
Yeah.
So that felt to me like, it's like, that we know that's what Ben is doing. He's observing all of these people. And even though the book is not like from his perspective, we get this idea that, you know, we're learning about these people that he's going to interact with at some level or not, and we're getting kind of insight into their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and an important note is that Ben Mears has returned to Salem's Lot because he spent time there as a boy with his aunt, and he's come back to write a story to overcome some traumatic experience he's had that led to him leaving the town in the first place.
And where that experience matters.
Yes,
very,
it does.
very much.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, just to say that the reason why, I'm not saying like it feels like an anthology in a bad way. I was captivated.
I didn't think
Yeah,
and
I really
enjoyed
enjoyed
it.
it.
But Ben Mears is an author doing research in this town, and people that he is making friends with, or people that he's dating, ask him what he's writing about, and he won't tell them. And meanwhile, we get these interstitial chapters of characters, stories, and it does support that idea of like we are in Ben Mears' shoes, and we are observing the town through his eyes, even though those POV chapters aren't told from his perspective. It's a cool effect that you could do with a TV show as well, but it feels unique to storytelling.
Yeah, it's definitely
to
interesting.
books and novels.
And it also really helps encapsulate that small town feel, because even if you look at all these different anthologies of all these individual characters, they're still like, oh, here's me mentioning so-and-so's daughter, and so like it ties that into that super, super small culture of like everybody knows your business, and everybody has opinions on your business too.
Yes.
Which is fun. It's a good atmospheric thing.
Yeah, it's a crazy difficult thing to do. The scope on this book, and I talk about scope too much, is crazy.
Yeah.
Because he's managing so many different characters that feel believable and real. Like, I'm thinking, for example, about one main character, Susan Norton, is that her name? She's the love interest for Ben Mears. They first meet at a park, and then they start dating throughout the book. And she has her own life going on too, where her mom doesn't approve of Ben as a boy she's dating, a man she's dating.
Floyd Tibbets.
She doesn't approve of Ben.
Right. She likes Floyd Tibbets.
She likes Floyd, which is the boy that Susan has been dating for the past year and a half, and she wants her to marry him, and her father approves of Ben. So that's just to say that he does a good job of making every character feel like they have relationships, they have lives to live.
Yeah.
And you care about them too.
Yes. And he tells Susan's story from start to finish. And that's just one character among a handful, several.
Yeah.
That
it's a huge cast.
Yes.
Yeah, it is.
And when I was first reading this book, I was obviously engaged. But I was waiting for like, okay, are we going to bring up the vampires?
Right.
Are we going to start hunting the vampires soon?
It was a slow burn
Okay,
for
well,
the vampires.
I will say this. I think that is a trope of horror. Right? So one of the great things about reading or watching horror is that you start off with an understanding that something's going to go wrong. So the longer you can make the reader feel like everything's normal, the more anticipation it builds.
Yeah.
That is one thing I like, especially about horror written in the 70s and 80s, right? Like, you don't need to show anything until the last minute.
Sure.
And if you want an interesting contrast, I mean, I do think if you're reading Salem's Lot, it's definitely worth watching at least the first half hours. As far as I could get through, I will finish watching that Max thing. But
It's required watching.
I know. It starts off in 30 seconds, you see, like, gruesome blood horror.
Yeah.
And all that anticipation is lost.
That is
Interesting.
modern day contemporary style
I think so.
storytelling.
Yeah.
To hook your reader right away.
Well,
But Midnight Mass kind of took that slow approach. You know something's
and that's why
wrong.
it's so great.
I know. And same with
Yes.
House on Hill and I mean, a lot of those.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Pace is super important with horror.
yes, I agree. Can I amend my statement?
Yeah.
Maybe my problem wasn't with, I didn't feel like we were on an adventure yet, because what captivates you about Ben Mears, he's the protagonist, and he's a very well-written character, and I like him, even though, and never mind, he's a little bit of an embarrassing self-insert, but I do that with the stuff that I write too. All of my characters, there's parts of who I am, and I'm like, this person who's just like me, he's the hero, he's smart and handsome, but he's a little bit nerdy, and he can get a pretty girl to fall in love with him, and he can still hang out with her dad, who likes to drink beer and play badminton. It's that sort of stuff where it's like cringy because it was relatable. That's all I'm going to say about that.
I get that too. Yeah, I understand.
Ben Mears, his goal is to write a book. So it's like, what's he going to do with this book? Well, he spends most of his time rented out a room at an Airbnb or someplace, writing all day. That's not super interesting plot. What was engaging about him and his story is what's the mystery of what happened at the Marston house. Yeah. Like, while he's dating Susan, she's asking him about what he's writing, and he's dodgy because clearly he's writing about a very traumatic experience. So that was what was engaging to me about Ben Mears' story. And then meanwhile, he's hooking you with like several other characters and scenes throughout the book. And like you were saying, his greatest strength is that he's a good character writer.
Yeah.
Where it's like he'll introduce Mark Petrie. Where he's this elementary school kid, new kid in town, right? And he's getting bullied, and he beats the shit out of his bully. And it's like, wow, I really like this Mark Petrie guy. And then it's like, let's jump over to this guy who lives at a dump and shoots weasels all day. It's like, wow, that was engaging, but Mark was cool and Ben is cool, so let's jump to a new POV. You know, that's why it felt like an anthology
stop
to
and
me.
start and stop and
Yeah,
start.
I totally agree.
Right, where he had his foot on the gas and the brake at the same time.
Yeah,
and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it's just a different style of storytelling.
Yeah, for sure.
Even the way that this book is set up in the book, I'm so glad I listened to the Audible book, because if you look at like the chapters, they don't make sense. Like the setup of the book. It goes like, Chapter 1, Ben, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
Yeah.
Chapter 1, Susan, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Chapter 2. Like, it was bizarre. The formatting was weird.
That's a very typical King format.
Okay.
Is to kind of think of things in like chunks, and then inside those chunks he'll have concatenated 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
And this is the first Stephen King thing I've ever read.
Yeah,
so
it's pretty common as far as like his format, and usually those, he'll say like, Ben is our main character for this whole entire book, but then he'll only maybe write one chapter about Ben, and then but usually what'll happen if you really dig into it is then it would be Ben, part 1, it would kind of go through that, and part 2 would be something about maybe Susan, and then it would be her opinion or take on Ben and how it relates to Ben.
Yeah.
So all those inside there, how they relate.
It made sense listening to the Audible book, but when I tried to follow along with the book, I got confused.
I can totally see that. Yeah. I think this is this is one of his most experimental books. It's interesting that it's his second book.
Yeah.
Because I do think it's highly experimental. And as far as like pace, of course, I think it's part of that too. But I also think that what's experimental about it is like he takes omniscient to the nth degree.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Sometimes in the same paragraph.
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And that is definitely a style of the time.
Definitely.
Something
that is basically gone now.
Right. Even in his prologue, he referenced Lord of the Rings as a source of inspiration, where he's like, he read it after Dracula, and he said, Lord of the Rings is just like Dracula, but it's in a different fantasy setting. Lord of the Rings, sometimes he'll swap POVs within the same paragraph, where it's like he's not even separating out, like, Frodo thought this thing, and then it's the next sentence, Sam thought this thing.
King does that too.
And King does that as well. Yes. Which I like, and we don't see it very often.
It's done very, very well, too.
Yeah. But you can see how something like Salem's Lot, which does feel very experimental, and I really enjoyed reading it for those reasons, could lead to something like The Stand, where it's like he took all the lessons he learned from that,
Absolutely,
and now it's like let's boil down my POVs to like 3 main characters, basically, and then occasionally you can have sections of your book where it's like I just want to write like several POVs, totally different characters, and that's a really cool way to expand on your world through characters, but those characters could also explore different parts of your world that your main characters won't experience. The risk you run with writing a book like that is boring your audience. Right. And you have to be really good, like Stephen King is, at engaging them in a scene and a character right away. Like, there's one scene with a bus driver. And there's like maybe 2 chapters in this entire book from his perspective, but they were some of my favorite.
Yeah, they're very fun.
He writes like degenerate creeps and losers so well.
A little
he makes them so interesting.
Well. Just kidding.
Well, he exaggerates all of his character
it's
archetypes.
so fun.
Definitely.
But the creeps, he's not afraid to like show you just how horrible these people are.
Yeah. I loved that so much. We get this whole book about vampires killing people, and there's all these monsters who are slaves to the whims of their predatory behavior and stuff. And then the next chapter is just from the point of view of a pedophile or a rapist. And you're like,
who's the monster here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Vampires are doing it because they're literal monsters. Humans are doing it because they're monsters in such a different way.
Yeah.
It's such a good commentary.
It's a really good point. So two characters to me that stand out for that. Actually, 3 characters that are kind of interesting. So Weasel is a guy who lives in the dump, right? That's what he does. And he shoots rats all day. He has a very poor opinion of the store merchant that he buys his stuff from. He thinks he's kind of a worthless person.
He's got a humpback.
He's got a huge hump on his back.
He's a social pariah.
Yeah, everyone in town hates him. He has a crush on Susan Norton. Not just a crush, but like
was it on Susan? I thought it was
an obsession.
Ruth something.
He talks about Ruth too, but he thinks about Susan in particular, and
It doesn't matter
obsesses on her.
The point is that
so we see this guy's just a creep, and then Crockett is another one that's interesting. So Crockett is the guy who owns the real estate company.
Yep, I got them mixed up. There's a lot of different characters.
Yes.
They all kind of blend together.
And Crockett is a monster because he's a slave to money.
Yeah.
And so when this Straker guy comes and says, do all these terrible things for me, horrible things, he's like, okay. So there's that monster. And then what's the guy's name that has the young wife and the
Mr.
young
Sawyer.
baby? Sawyer.
I think it's Mr. Sawyer.
He's a dirtbag, obviously, because his wife, he finds she's having an affair with another man. He almost kills the man, leaves him kind of like emotional wreck.
Humiliated.
Totally humiliates him, and then proceeds to sexually assault his wife over and over again. To treat her that because of what she had done.
Yeah.
So we see these 3 monsters, but the interesting thing to me is that, Stephen King definitely shows how they're monsters, but Stoker has a scene with all 3 of them, and he treats them completely different. And Stoker is this pliable politician, and you're like, wow, who's the monster here? And they're all humans. So Stoker is not a vampire. Right? He's a familiar, I guess. A human familiar.
Well, that's
I don't know.
Just as a small side note, he does a good job of showing you someone like Straker. They pronounce his name differently in the audiobook, but I can't remember.
Yeah.
As is he a vampire or is he just an immortal being who serves a vampire?
Yeah, you don't really know.
It's cool. I love that he leaves those things unsaid.
I totally agree.
Well, because it would be out of Straker's personality to be like, I'm a vampire, or do you know what I mean? To explain to all these worthless humans what his job does and what he fulfills specifically.
Yeah.
He does have strange powers of persuasion, though, like you were saying.
Yeah. Because he can talk to anybody.
Yeah. And I wonder, and I would bet that he has something to say about, speaking of socioeconomic issues, or, how our systems are built to encourage predatory behavior that's legalized.
Yeah.
As opposed to certain behaviors that aren't looked upon in a positive light in society. I don't know. And maybe vampires are used as a way to represent, politicians or people who work in real estate. They're the real vampires that leech on society. I didn't catch any of that stuff, but it feels like the pieces are in place to say something like that.
Yeah.
And that's one of my favorite things about...
I know, it's so interesting.
Those are some of my favorite stories. That's why I like Terry Pratchett so much, is because he does something similar where he makes a commentary on the modern world, but in a very goofy fantasy setting.
Yeah.
Right.
Stephen King does that same thing, but with a very different noir tone.
Yeah. There was a trend online recently about people would ask women, would you rather be in a room alone with a bear or a man? And every single woman says bear, because they would rather be in the room with a monster that they know what the behavior is going to be than be in a room with an unreliable, potential worse than bear monster thing. It's that same kind of social commentary of I'm not making it about women's experiences specifically, but it makes you question, like, oh, okay, a bear would kill you because a bear would kill you. What would an unreliable, unknown human do to another human? Yeah,
could be so much worse.
Yeah, and that human, like the human that beats his wife or beats his child or does horrible things, that's not the real monster. The real monster is the bear that would attack you in a room if provoked.
I don't know, because you expect that from the bear. What's worse?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder.
Yeah.
His vampires were really interesting from a world-building perspective because not only... Maybe it's really traditional in the way that vampires are presented in media. And maybe it's heavily inspired by Dracula, which we haven't read yet. I haven't read yet.
Me either.
But they're very persuasive.
It'll happen at the end of the month.
Yes.
One of their superpowers is, like, if you watch a vampire in the eyes, it has to be invited in your home, obviously. And if you watch the vampire's eyes and you listen to it telling you these things, it's almost hypnotic and it convinces you to do what you want it to do. So there's obviously something there. He's saying something about what, I don't know, politicians or
greed and power, I think. Things. Yeah. To me the thing with it is well, I think probably what I like about it, and it's kind of why I wanted you guys to read it, especially since I knew you were reading Twilight, is that this is kind of a quintessential to me vampire book, right? Where there is kind of a head king vampire that we find out is thousands of years old at the end of the book. He's been around for thousands of years. And yet there are all these other vampires that are a little bit like a mindless version of him.
It's like the underlings.
Yeah. And nobody's sexy and attractive and alluring and can have, meet and actually talk with people. Danny Glick, who is kind of the first vampire that's turns 2 or 3 other people in the book, including his mother, and yet there's no conversation with Danny and them. It's not like he goes, hey, everything's okay, like come and hang out. There's few words here, so they're kind of mindless. And so I like that. I like that it just feels like flat out terror, as opposed to like...
It's like a virus.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and that fact that, like, how easy it is to turn someone to a vampire, it just, you feel, like, out of control. And I guess what I'm saying, like, I'm coming to this, too, where the thing that I feel when I read this book, and it's interesting to read it now because of some political stuff that's happening, where I feel like it doesn't matter what I do. Like, I can go vote. I live in the state of Utah. My vote does not matter.
Yeah.
Right? I can go and, rally against Mike Lee when he did a town hall. Of course it was virtual town hall because he wouldn't want to come to Sanpete County. I could have gone and jumped on the phone, and I have plenty of stuff I'd like to say to Mike Lee. But why?
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not just Mike Lee. It's that Mike Lee is, quote unquote, poisoned all of the people in my community.
Yeah.
Right? So there's an interesting thing there when it comes to this vampire thing, where it's like, it's not just the big vampire. It's the big vampire has influenced or infected hundreds of other people, and you don't know who is who. So I like that.
And those people who are infected could be people that you dearly love.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that too.
So he also does a very good job of making that feel extremely painful. That was also very similar. So Midnight Mass was obviously inspired by this. At least I think so. I think it was. And Midnight Mass does something similar, where it's like the good guys don't really win. But evil doesn't necessarily win either. And Stephen King mentions that in his prologue, where he said, I think when he originally planned to write this story, he just wanted the vampires to win. But as he wrote his story, some of his characters, like Mark and Ben, turned out to be more heroic than he anticipated. So while they don't necessarily save the town or save the day, like Salem ends up in ruins.
Yeah.
And something similar happens in Midnight Mass. Evil doesn't necessarily achieve its overall plans, I should say.
Yeah.
It's more nebulous than just good versus evil.
Yeah, for sure. It's more gray,
Yeah. I guess what I'm saying is, like, people that Ben loves are killed. And in horrible ways.
Yes.
So his victory feels hollow in that sense.
It's like he's won, but at what cost?
Yeah.
Right.
Which I love that trope. I love when that happens at the end of a book.
So do I. But to me, it had a bit more of a hopeful note to it because characters like Ben and Mark chose to keep fighting the vampire even though it felt totally hopeless. Like, the way poor Jimmy dies, wow.
Yeah.
Horrifying. And as a small side note, he is so great at coming up with creative kills and creative scenes.
Really good
Yeah.
at that.
Like, I wonder if...
There's, like... Oh, yeah, you keep going.
Well, Ben and Mark, towards the end of the story, it's after Jimmy dies and it's after Susan dies, too, which is also horrible. But so many memorable scenes like that are just so visual. I'm just there, present with those characters. They go to the local law enforcement, Parkins, Gillespie, and we get some chapters from his perspective.
I can't wait to hear what you say here, because this is a big one to me.
Yeah. They go to law enforcement to tell him, like, there are vampires.
People are being
they're
murdered.
real. And they're like, we are out of options. We have tried to handle the situation as intelligently as possible. And he does something similar in The Mist, which is also fantastic, where it's like the main characters, they're very relatable, because if you were really in Ben Meer's shoes, you would do everything that he did. It's like, let's think about this. You and I, this person died, they turn into a vampire. If law enforcement comes by, they're going to think that we're murderers. We're both outsiders. You're a loner. Let's get our story straight. Like, that's what I would do. You're a smart person, but you still fail. It makes the world feel so hopeless. So when they're like, our last option is to go to law enforcement and to just tell them, like, vampires are real, we have nothing else to say. Here's our evidence. Come and help us out. And the policeman says, he beats them to the punch. And he says, there are vampires, right? After Ben is like, we have something horrible to tell you, and you're not going to believe us. And he is so taken off guard. I did not expect that at all.
And the other thing beyond that, I love that too. That's so great, because you feel like that would happen, right? The whole town is probably thinking this. And I like that concept of the zeitgeist being revealed.
Yeah.
Right? That's really fun. And the other thing that I love about... Gillespie's one of my favorite characters in the book. Because he starts off, he's like hard-boiled detective. Like, it feels like this is Stephen King making a definitive nod towards noir.
Yeah.
Right? And he is definitely a noir or pulp writer.
Even the way the audiobook reads him, he's got a strong Brooklyn accent.
It's great. Yeah, it's so good. And he's got, like, all the tropes. The worthless helper. All these things.
He's a loner.
Nally? I can't remember. The thing that I love about him is, in the end, he makes a perfect noir choice. And it's this. I can't help you, so I'm leaving. Yeah. And Ben is so put off by it. He calls him a coward. And how can you do this? But he's like, look.
We're all going to hell.
And the great thing about it is, if you look at this is... do you guys spoil the crap out of these, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
We've already said it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, every survivor leaves.
Yeah.
Every survivor has the exact same resolution in this book.
Yeah.
Because what are you supposed to do?
You cannot
run
beat
away.
this.
Yes. You run away.
Yes.
Every survivor leaves.
Yeah. And before we go on to talk about, like, how Salem's Lot is a good microcosm for, like, just human society and civilizations, our biggest empires in general, they'll eventually all crumble and fall. And even our most trusted systems like law enforcement will eventually fail us because of vampires. Insert whatever you want for that to represent. Someone like Ben and Mark still persevere.
Yes.
That's the indomitable human spirit. That's the really corny thing that I have to cling to, because real life is so depressing.
But everybody does when you read it. You can't help it, It's refreshing to be like, there's one person left. There's one person who's trying. There's like, it's just... How can you not hope that you'd be that one person?
Yeah.
So a couple of interesting things, like historical stuff here. So Stephen King intended to write a sequel to this book. So there's a lot of people who talk about the Stephen King multiverse, and this is kind of canonically the first book in the Stephen King multiverse.
We have another multiverse.
Yes.
But he did it first, so it's okay.
He totally did it first. So one person that escapes is Callahan, and we should talk about him, because I think he's a really good, another good kind of, like, one of the most human characters in the book, which is interesting.
Really important.
Yeah, he's very, very important because of
You have to have a priest in your vampire book.
You have to.
And you have to have a priest who also starts to question all of his things.
Yes, yes. So he shows up again in a series called The Dark Tower. I think in the Wolves of Kala. So he shows up in the second or the third, I guess that's the third Dark Tower series. And there are other characters that kind of get dispersed throughout his multiverse that are pretty important. So the interesting thing to me is that this book feels like a sequel was ready. Yeah. You know, so Ben coming at the end of the book and lighting a field on fire to kind of burn Salem's Lot is like, that is ripe for a sequel to happen. Yeah. But something about that not ever happening, I love. I love that it ends. That's the only hope in the entire book to me, is that he lights the field on fire. Like, he's going to start something. Right. And it's pretty rare, I think, for an author to leave a book there and not be like, I'm going to go tell everybody what I want. Yeah. And I also think it's very brave. I think it's very experimental, and I love that it ends that way. I'm glad he hasn't written a sequel.
So do I. And I think it's because in Salem's Lot, he's already said what he set out to say. And expanding on that anymore would be like beating a dead horse. Yeah. The marketable thing to do would be to say, okay, now I'm going to pick up Ben Mears. He takes the place of Father Callahan. Mark takes the place of Ben Mears, and we do the same thing in a new city. And Mark, now he's trying to deal with his trauma, and he has to talk to Ben. And
poor Mark.
That would be, I know, geez, what up? I mean, that's the tone of this book. You know, it's very similar, actually, in terms of messaging to something like Guards by Terry Pratchett, where it's like his point of view on society is very cynical, and how power will corrupt people, absolutely. And how it will eventually, all of our empires will lead to collapse because of that, because we can't maintain pure systems. But Terry Pratchett, it differs in terms of tone, where he presents an impossible dilemma, where it's like, how do we fix fascism? And he ends it with a joke. Right, where it's like, I don't have an answer, but I'll let you laugh anyway, because that's what a story is for. It's supposed to let you fantasize and make you feel some brightness in your hope dystopian life. Yeah. And Stephen King is the exact opposite.
Yeah. Well, like, I remember, spoiler alert, I got to the point where Susan gets turned into a vampire, and I said to Dad, why did I think anything good would happen? Yeah. They literally turned a 10-month-old baby into a vampire, too. Did I really think anybody would have a happy ending here?
Right.
Yeah. But I do love that. I do love that. I mean, we should maybe... A couple of plot things. I think we should talk about a couple of plot things.
Can I use the bathroom real quick? So can we pause? Yeah. I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine.
This is a desperate situation.
Oh, let me pause this.
I'll pause the timer.
I know, I always forget to... I've been remembering so good, and then I forgot today.
I'm glad you liked it.
I did.
I'm a little surprised. I didn't think you would.
Well, once we talk about the sexism, I'll tell you, I didn't like it until it got scary, because I was like...
Yeah.
But I did like it. And looking back on it, I liked it more than while I was reading it. Which sounds weird.
No, I understand that. I totally understand that. Yeah. I think that's kind of the spell he weaves, though.
I think so, too.
He's very good at that.
Yeah, I really do want to watch the HBO thing. It's a movie, not a series. Oh, I'm surprised.
I think...
You should just watch Midnight Mass and tell yourself it's...
That's so funny, because I literally started that this morning. I started watching Midnight Mass, and then I was like, oh, actually, I should watch Salem's Lot, because we're going to do it. And I got like a half hour in before I had to come up here.
So
like here's some things.
People didn't get the point of the book.
Susan Norton's mom and dad, their relationship where the dad likes him and the mom doesn't, is so important. Yeah. Right? There's no dad. The dad died.
What?
Yes. And you know the accident that Ben Mears had, where he killed his wife in a car accident? No. His parents were killed in a car accident.
What?
Like, they changed major plot things.
Why are you fundamentally changing things like
Susan Norton, who is an artist and a free spirit, and that's part of her thing. She seeks adventure. That's what I like about her character. No, she works as the secretary to...
they made it even more sexist?
The secretary to the real estate agent.
Wow.
What?
Yeah, I mean, they just changed everything.
That's already only 30 minutes in, and they've already changed so much. Goodness gracious.
And Ralphie and Danny Glick. Ralphie gets kidnapped. We don't know how, but he disappears on their way to see Mark Petrie. That's who they're going to see. Yeah. They never get there. No, in the show they just totally live it. They're all hanging out in Mark's room. oh, we're so
They're all
glad to have a new
friends?
friend. And they die on the way back, and they show Stoker literally capture him and take him away.
Oh.
They just show
talking
everything.
about the HBO thing.
And so much, it's
I kind of like Mark being able to play with Danny and Ralph.
I like that
Beforehand.
too, to some point. Yeah. Yeah.
But I think it's important to see him be like, I'm sticking up for myself because I'm a good,
Yeah,
you know
but
what I mean?
they show that. They show
Okay,
him
okay.
kind of in that fight thing. They also start off with him trying to show everyone how to do a Houdini trick, so they're trying to plant that seed in the
Setting
first
up,
chapter.
yeah.
Like, I mean, it's a different medium, all those different things, but I just didn't like it.
Yeah.
Yikes.
You know. Anyway.
I'm okay with the setting up, like the Houdini stuff too. And then
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
Later.
It's definitely different. You know, one of the things, like, you and I kind of talked about this the other day. I don't know, I guess we're going again. I don't know where we picked off.
Yeah, I don't remember where we stopped.
Oh, we started talking about plot, but we can cut anything there too.
No, you keep going if you had a thought about a couple of plot points that you wanted to reference.
I think some things that are important to...
Thank you.
I think... Okay.
Yeah.
I think a couple of things that are worth talking about when it comes to plot are important because they feed to, like, this whole, like, big story thing we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
The book starts off introducing Ben and Susan. And they show it as this absolutely innocent, sweet, love at first sight kind of relationship, right? And maybe the second or third time you meet him, she already tells him, I love you. Like, I mean, it's this, like, insta-love kind of thing, unbelievable. And I think that's super relatable because I think a lot of people either want that experience or they've had that experience where it's like, I didn't realize my life was great. And part of that works is because Ben is still trying to recover from a very traumatic thing where he had his wife on the back of a motorcycle, crashed the motorcycle. There were questions if he was drinking or not. They don't really specifically say it, but his wife died. So to have another connection is huge for him. It goes right from that to two boys, Ralphie and Danny Glick. Danny is wanting to go meet this boy named Mark Myers, Mark Petrie, who's a new person in his school because he has some cool things to show, some monster things to show. But his parents won't let him go unless he takes Ralphie.
Yeah.
On the way, it's getting dark, a little too dark. They're supposed to be home by dark. And Ralphie literally goes missing. We don't know what happens to Ralphie.
It's very well written scene.
It is.
Well,
He's so good at
beautiful.
leaving things unsaid.
And to see it from Danny's point of view too, where Danny was like, I'm not scared of monsters, and then Ralphie starts seeing things, and then Danny's like,
Oh, I can feel it.
oh no, something bad is happening, and to be the older brother and to suddenly be like, he's gone. Oh gosh, that would be so chilling. Like, it's so
terrifying.
well written.
Yeah.
So, and to go home and be like, I lost. Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh.
it's horrible.
Yeah, it's horrible. And so he establishes both the ultra sweet relationship between between Ben and Susan, and then the horrific side. So in the first 5 minutes, we have, I think, the theme of the book.
Yeah.
We have, so even though like now I think it would be like first 5 minutes you want your inciting incident. The first 30 pages, your inciting incident.
Yeah.
Well, in the first 30 pages of this book, he instigates the theme. There's not an inciting, I guess actually Ralphie being
Ralphie is
that's
the
is the
inciting
inciting
incident.
incident. Yeah.
Yes, you're right. He expresses the spectrum of the story,
Yes.
which is the ultra sweet and the horror that could come from, risking losing someone that you love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and how it can totally be outside of your control. A freak thing and trying to heal from that.
Yeah.
So, geez, he's just really a master at putting all those things together. Just as a brief anecdote, talking about how, like, he writes that scene when Ralphie disappears so well, like, the vampire Straker, we know kidnaps him, but we fill in the blanks of how that happens, but he never says, there was this tall white figure and he picked up
Burlap
Ralphie and said,
sack
I've stolen your child. Yeah, puts a bowl, puts him in a bowl, what did you
Burlap
say?
sack.
Burlap sack?
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Have you seen the Max thing? The Max
Is
movie?
that what happens?
But
Literally.
Oh no, I have not seen it.
Oh man.
I think
Yeah.
I prefer this method of storytelling because he's trying to make you feel like you're in a horror book.
Absolutely.
And the fear of the unknown is so much more powerful than like describing every single thing that's happening with something horrible
Right.
that's
and,
going on.
And I think as a storyteller, it's easier to go to the audience, what do you think the worst thing could have happened is?
Yeah. Exactly.
Instead of saying tall, creepy man stole the kid in the middle of the night. Because then you're like, oh no, a tall, creepy man. Versus he disappeared with no sound and no trace and no one knows what happened.
That's so much more terrifying.
Way more terrifying. And your mind fills in the worst blanks.
So there's a Brandon Sanderson lecture. And it's my time to talk about Brandon Sanderson.
It's not a podcast episode if Tanner doesn't talk about a Brandon Sanderson lecture.
Yes. Where he talks about something called the triangle of abstraction.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember if it's at the top or the bottom of the triangle, which side is more abstract and which side is more concrete. I think the more abstract side is on the bottom because you could say something like, Ralphie disappeared and what happened to him is more abstract. Mm-hmm. So you will fill in the blanks of like, what's a scary moment of my life where I felt like I lost someone that I loved, or I felt like I was alone and at risk of being murdered or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That's so much more relatable and more powerful of a feeling than something that's a concrete description.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
So he illustrates that concept beautifully in this book. Like there's so much more that you can say with less.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting because I only have a couple of hang-ups with this book. Pretty minor things. One of my biggest hang-ups is that both Ben and Susan say I love you. I think that would have been better left shown too. So there's some interesting things, and I wonder at that time is he had those kind of complex relationship in his life? He's his mid-20s. I think he decided he was 28 when he wrote it. Has he gone through those things?
Oh, the author.
The author.
Yeah.
Right, because I felt like that was the one thing that wasn't quite delivered. So there's that. There's another one, but it doesn't matter. But you know what I was going to say is that I think if I were teaching a class in writing, I would use this book as the perfect classic example of dramatic irony, right? Where from the very beginning, there's vampires. Mm-hmm. You don't, just because you know what the book is, right? You know it's going to be here. So everyone who reads the book knows what's happening, and you get to watch the entire city figure it out. Mm-hmm. And so the whole time, even when you meet Stoker, at the very, very first scene that you see him, where he's telling the real estate agent guy what to do, you're like, don't do it.
Yeah. It's a vampire.
You're delivering the coffin to the basement. Yep. We all know, right? Those kinds of things are so great. And that dramatic irony is another, like I said, great thing for horror. This is, if you're going to write horror, you should break this book down.
Yeah. Absolutely. And dramatic irony, for people who don't know, is when the reader knows something that the characters in the book don't.
Right. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I should have said that.
No, that's okay. Yeah. I mean, you described what it was by using a very good example. The whole, Susan expresses her love for Ben first. Mm-hmm. And that may be sacrificing believability for delivering your theme, or cementing their relationship before it's broken.
Yeah.
Maybe it's he prioritized mechanics over form.
Well, I will say Stephen King really struggles to write women characters at all, so that could be part of it too.
Definitely in this book. Yeah, I mean, we should talk about the female characters. There's really only 4 that I can think of.
Yeah, and all of them are hot and sad and abused.
Or horrible, the gossiping lady.
Yes. I forgot her name. The archetypes that the women fall under, and I recognize the whole book is archetypes pushed to the very limit, which is good and really interesting, and it's fantastic, but that still doesn't excuse the sexism in it. I got to about halfway through this book, and I seriously had to really push myself to finish it, because all of the female characters were really unbelievable from my point of view, and just incredibly sad and damaged, which everybody's sad and damaged, but it was so much more pushed towards all of the female characters to be young, naive, abused by all of the men in their life, and
powerless.
Totally powerless. And even Ben is watching Susan walk up the stairs, and her butt is so hot, and I was like,
yeah, I forgot about that. You are right.
And there's just a lot of moments where it was hard for me to read, because it felt like a lot of dude bros talking about important things, and then the hot girls.
100% that's that.
And so it was hard for me to get to it. I was talking to my sister, our sister, your daughter, all of the pronouns you can throw in there, about it, and I was like, I want more scary, less sexism. Mm-hmm. And once it did get more scary, and Susan, the character who I had the most hang-ups with, writing-wise, gets a lot bigger of a part, she's more activated, and so I enjoyed it more once it did get more scary, but boy, was it hard for me to read. for those
Yes.
things.
I can see that.
She
I
does
totally agree.
perform the role of the love interest up until the moment when she leaves the house and goes against her mother's wishes.
Yeah.
But that and her deciding to go and kill the vampire on her own in another part in the story are like really the only two moments when a female character feels like they are taking their own destiny into their own hands.
Yeah. Yeah, like, and it's also hard to read. Like, I understand this book is older, and it's a sign of the times that it was written, and all that.
Yeah,
but
sure.
you can still
We
not
don't need
be
to
a
excuse it.
sexist, you
Yeah.
know?
Yes.
You could still do that, and, like, all of the female characters are just so battered and bruised, and it's like, that's not...
It's hard to read.
It's hard to read, and it should be hard to read, and, like, there's even a line that kind of threw me for a loop because he's really sexist in his writing, and then he has a line about... I think it's Matt who says it, and he says, you know, if we had access to safe abortions, this female character wouldn't be in this crappy situation now. So it was kind of like are you sexist or are you supporting? Like, it was an interesting thing. But,
Yes.
you know, I liked that, and it was good to see that, okay, there's more to these women characters than just being here to be an example for how men are monsters. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just
Yes.
such a bad victimology of it all. Like, there's more to these women than that, and there should be, but there isn't in the book.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's definitely a sign of the times, right? Like, the 1970s were very different, for sure. And, okay, I'm going to tell you a small tangent here. Like, so my dad was an orchestra teacher. You guys know that? And I remember him saying that he was afraid for me wanting to be an artist. And kind of thought he was mostly saying, yeah, you'll never make a living and, you know, all those things, whatever. But he said, no, here's why I'm afraid for you being an artist. He's like, as a musician, while I'm playing, unless it's being recorded, if I make a mistake, it's gone immediately. The moment the mistake is made, it's gone. But when you do something in art, you immortalize it forever. Right?
Yeah.
So if you read some of Stephen King's more current stuff, even not even more current stuff, like The Stand is an excellent example of some extremely strong women characters in those books. There's also some misogyny. There's and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
It's a freaking brick. It's huge. To be able to look at what he wrote in 1975 and go, wow, there was some pretty bad stuff here.
Person,
and then
hopefully.
to read his next book, which was Pet Sematary, where it's like, wow, tons of Native American mythology. Ooh,
Lots
like
of whitewashing.
Yeah, lots of whitewashing. So, like, you can see that kind of that change. And once again, it's not an excuse. I think you're absolutely right. 100% right. Matter of fact, I thought that too. And I didn't just think of it with Susan, who was
everybody.
intentionally a sex object. I thought, like, Susan's parents. Susan's dad's this good old boy.
Yeah.
He's willing.
And her
He
mom
loves
is
everybody.
mad
Mom is
because
mad all the
she's
time.
not dating the boy next door, and my
Yeah.
whole life is about who you're gonna marry and have a baby with. And it's
Yeah,
like,
it was
my
pretty
gosh,
uncomfortable.
give her a hobby at least.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, she was an artist. Oh, wait, the mom? No, she was
No,
nothing.
no, she wasn't. She was a
nothing.
gossip, just like every other
Yeah.
character who wasn't battered and bruised,
Yeah.
who was a woman.
You're 100% right. Yeah.
It's very noticeable, and I wonder if Susan, at the end of the book being sacrificed, is another homage to Dracula. Again, I haven't read it, but yeah, the vampires, that's a big part of their mythology.
Well, it's like sacrificing virgin women.
Yes. So he put that in the book because that's what you do for a vampire in your book. And I'm not trying to excuse any sexism or misogyny. You could obviously, like, why not make Jimmy a woman? Why not make Mark a girl?
It
Yeah.
would have been great.
Yeah.
Honestly, it would have been great.
Yeah.
It's really noticeable in the last act of this book when the main characters are really committed to hunting the vampire, that it's like, it's just a room of white dudes. Their names are Mark, Matt, Jimmy, Ben. And it's like, I can't keep these white guys straight.
Yeah, that's something else I had a hard time
For
with.
someone who's such a good character writer and writing distinct characters with different worldviews and different pasts, they really just feel like the same smear of
Yeah.
bland whiteness.
Yeah.
Because they're even the same ages,
For sure.
too.
Yeah.
Like, we just need... And I know that you're, like, writing about a book in a small town in New England, right? There's
Probably
no
is all white guys.
diversity there.
Yes,
Named Matt.
yes.
Yeah.
Matt Callahan.
But you...
Yeah.
Midnight Mass does a really good job of this, too, by having really
Women.
good, strong female characters.
Yep.
And they even have an...
Muslim father and his son. They're
Yeah.
great in that
Super
story.
important,
yeah.
Really important.
Time to rewatch Midnight Mass.
And those characters being in this
season.
very white place is an important part of their characters that they talk about. Like, you could have some of that in this story.
Yeah.
Like,
and it could add to it.
it would make it better.
It would definitely make it
But
better.
I don't know. It's just he in this book he proves to me that he can't write women characters, and it's as simple as that. But you know, I'd like to read more of his other stuff and see him stretch his hand and stretch his skill in other directions to try to prove my opinion wrong. Because I don't want him to not be able to. It just reading this, I was like, I almost had to put it down. If it wasn't for this podcast, I would not have finished this book.
Interesting.
And it's just because that first half chunk, is just so disgraceful to all of the women in the book that I was like,
Yeah, I agree.
I can't get through it. But
I totally agree.
I did really enjoy it looking back on it, and once it got scary and Susan had more of an active role, I was like, okay, now we're cooking. You could have given this to us from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, and I think he attempts to make her, like, Susan's character is very consistent. I'll say that, right? She's the impulsive one that says, I love you 1st. She slaps her mother. She is active. She admits that, you know, she can't wait to leave the town, but she feels a little bit trapped. And then she's the one that, I still don't understand her motivation here, but she's the one that's like, okay, this was a little bit kind of convenient, but Matt and Ben both end up in the hospital. Ben gets beat up by her ex-boyfriend, and Matt has a heart attack. So they're both in the hospital. So it's like right after they'd already all planned to go together to go to the Marston house. And all of a sudden she's like, well, I'm not waiting. I'm going to go by myself.
Yeah.
And when I read that, I don't remember the first time, but when I read it this time, unfortunately I knew what was going to happen, but I thought, well, of course, you're going to go die.
Yeah.
And I did think that was kind of disappointing. But at the same point, it's like, oh, really? You're going to take the only thing that Ben has that's good and you're going to throw it to the vampire?
Yeah.
And there's this little bit of hope where you're like, okay, he's going to rescue her, and he doesn't. And I love that.
I do too.
But,
It kind of felt like, once again, he's pushing mechanics over form, where it's like, oh, well, at the end of the story, I want Susan to be sacrificed by the vampire. But how do I avoid making Susan feel like her motivation shift comes out of nowhere? And how do I empower her? I also want Ben to lose her because it's very important for his character in medias res stuff. Before the book began, he lost his other wife, other love interest, whatever. So losing her is obviously important for his character, and I thought that stuff was done really well, but it comes at the cost of Susan's character being treated like an object.
Yeah, I think it maybe could have been more powerful if it was her decision. I know it was her decision to go to the vampire, but it would have been more powerful if it was her decision to become a vampire instead of her just going in all alone. If she was maybe stuck in the Marsden house with Matt and Ben and her, and she says, run, I'll distract him, or something like that.
To take a 9-year-old to it.
Yeah, it's a 9-year-old boy that has to save her life.
Yeah.
She can't do
and
it
how
herself.
is he supposed to? There's no...
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's the very smart, nerdy, underappreciated boy that saves her life, and not Susan. So,
saves his life.
It would have been great if this story was about Susan. She was going to be killed by the vampires, but she evades them, and then she has to kill them in the end. Like, you could do a gender role reversal, right?
Yeah, it would
And
be
then
more interesting.
She works together with Mark to try and save Ben, but she loses him.
And it would also be more fun because you could explore, like, maybe her core fear is dying in the same town that she's been stuck in her whole life. And she ultimately has to pick that core fear in order to save the people that she's gotten close to or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting.
But, you know, only women are capable of writing women, apparently.
Well,
that was me being silly.
Yeah, I will say this, though. Like, his first book is from the perspective of a woman. He's written a lot of stuff. It would be really interesting for you to read a couple and kind of get that. And that is one of the things, like, this is kind of weird, but to me, there was no such thing as middle grade when I was a kid. So when you were 10, you read whatever book you could get your hands on. And yes, there were books that were written for kids, but Stephen King was considered to be like one of those everybody reads books, right? Like Stand By Me, which is a book about kids, like middle grade. He's written books that are like high fantasy with dragons. He's written all kinds of, like, he's an extremely diverse writer. It would be interesting to read with that perspective to say, where is he missing this? Because now I'm interested. I mean, I'll read. Actually, I wanted to read Carrie again after this for some reason. I'm going to read Carrie and see if it.
Yeah, I'd like to read Carrie,
similar
especially if Carrie happened before this book.
It does, and it's once again like super heavily religious.
Yeah.
Deals with scrupulosity. It deals with all kinds of interesting things with a very demanding mom. So I'm going to read it after this. I'm pretty interested to see kind of where it hits because I have revisionist history and I'm like, oh, it's totally from the woman's point of view. Of course, she's the most important thing. So now I want to see.
It's also difficult to see the line between like this book was written in 1975 and he's writing about a town, a very white patriarchal town, religious town in like the 1960s or 50s or something. I don't know the time period when it's set. So there is a lot of misogyny in this book from characters that are misogynistic.
Yes.
And once again, I'm not excusing it, but it's
important to look at both sides of that too.
Yeah.
Maybe writings about someone like Carrie, a main character who's a female. It's like what you're supposed to do for a protagonist. How do you make an interesting protagonist? They're supposed to be active.
Yeah. Yeah.
They won't let things like misogyny get in their way. Or, I don't know.
Yeah.
Or those are the specific obstacles they overcome, and he can write those realistically for protagonists, but for side characters, maybe it's just more natural to not treat them with the respect that they deserve.
Yeah, well, it's like, even though that was the norm of the time, if you're writing from the perspective of a woman who's being beat by her husband, she's probably going to say, wow, I hate my husband, not...
Yeah.
And I don't know because I've been privileged enough to never be in that situation personally, but Stephen King's never been beat by his husband either.
No.
No.
I don't know. That was my pretty much only hang up was just the sexism. But
My hang up, this is so dumb. My hang up is that Mark also knows everybody. So there's a section towards the end where they're like, remember this guy, he died, and this guy, he died, and Mark knows them all too. And I'm like, wait, you're a 9-year-old kid who just moved here.
Yeah.
yeah,
So
that's a good
one flaw.
point. That's such a good point.
Mark is another kind of embarrassing insert character. He's like the really smart kid who knows everything, the Mary Sue. He knows this Houdini trick that can like...
It literally saves
his
life.
life.
Yeah.
Like, where did he read this thing about
He's
Houdini?
like-
That's
he's like-
believable enough, but he reached this like yogic meditative state, and
Yeah.
that chapter felt really indulgent.
It was, yeah,
I
that
thought
was
it was
so
fun.
weird.
I
It's
thought
like
it was
fun, but
so
it was
funny.
so weird.
I was like, dang,
Yeah.
if only Susan had read about Houdini.
Yeah. That's how you
This is
save
the
the
moral
day
of the
for
story.
the vampires. Yeah.
Yeah, that was pretty funny.
Houdini is vampires for mortal flaw.
Yeah.
Fatal flaw.
I could see myself, like, if I were writing that scene, if I were, like, in the zone, I'm, like, writing about the yogis, like, reaching this meditative state, and they're seeing nirvana and how they can, like, use telekinetic powers, where it's, like, the writing is beautiful.
Yeah.
And you could tell that he's having fun describing this scene, but you gotta zoom out and see what you're actually saying about this.
Yeah. For context, this scene takes place when Mark and Susan are both trapped in the vampire's den, and Mark has been tied up and is waiting for the evil vampire to come kill him. So he's like, now's my time to flex my Houdini skills and escape.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was pretty funny. And in the book, there was no idea that he knew Houdini was until that moment.
I was
It's
like, have
ta-da!
I
There's
missed
no
some
setup.
breadcrumbs before
Yeah.
here? Like,
No.
maybe he was bullied because he's so obsessed with Houdini?
Yeah, that would have been probably more fun, actually.
Mark is, yeah.
He's
I
he's
don't
a
like the term
great
Mary Sue,
but he is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
he is.
Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah, it's kind of annoying.
Yeah.
I was kind of like on the bully's side at the beginning of the book. Like, when I got to that moment, I was like, Mark is a dickhead. Like, he's
Smart
so
aleck.
pretentious
Yeah. Yeah.
and confident. My hang up with the book was how many conversations at the end there were about one character convincing another that the vampire's real.
Yes.
It's like
Yeah.
you have Mark or Matt convincing Ben that the vampire's real. And then you
Ben
have
convinces
Ben convincing
Susan.
Jimmy.
Oh, yeah,
And
yeah.
then Ben convinces Susan.
Tries to convince Susan. He never can.
There's like several characters
Yeah,
in a
'cause
row where
she's
it's
a
like,
stubborn girl.
yeah.
She's never gonna see reason. She's too emotional, and emotionally she'll never believe in vampires. I'm sorry.
She
But
does
she
Sorry.
decides to go and
Continue.
kill the vampire anyway, even though she
Yes.
doesn't believe it, because she
I
has
think
to be
that's
Well,
why.
because
quiet
she
about the
thought with
vampire
her
at the
heart
end
and
of
her
the book.
emotions, not her head.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of thought like that scene. Mallory was reading it last night when we were kind of visiting, and I said, I think this is probably one of the pivotal scenes in the book.
Yeah.
And part of that, I mean, obviously plot wise, it's very pivotal. Pivotal. There we go. But I also think it's kind of an interesting one because it's where I think my impression is that Susan is basically saying, I'm going to prove that this isn't real. Like, she's the empirical side of things. She's like, I'm going to go prove, and it costs her life.
Yeah.
And I think there's a whole lot of interesting things. I like what you were saying there. Like, it drove you nuts. It's like, Matt tells Ben tells, all this kind of stuff. It does feel like missionary work. Mm-hmm. And I liked that. I liked that it's like, all these people, like, you don't just believe in a vampire. Mm-hmm. You have to tell somebody hand to hand, or they have to witness it, like what Mark did. Like, Mark saw Danny Glick in his window with the autopsy scar.
Oh, I loved that moment.
So great. And he was like, I can't invite him in. I'm going to use the cross that I have. And, like, he did all the things that he knew about. Like, he was a witness. Right? Matt was a witness. I think they're the only 2 witnesses that survived.
Father Calderon.
Well, Father Callahan.
What about the there's one more person who hightails it out of town. It's the guy who's having an affair with Mr. Sawyer's wife.
He leaves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's the only other witness, and he leaves.
But when he's at the train station, he meets the vampire.
Yeah.
And he's like, let's go get your revenge. So he gets turned too.
Okay, yeah, right? That's right.
So I think the only witness that survives is Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Everyone else dies. So Father Callahan is an interesting one too. And we kind of mentioned him earlier too, but like, he doesn't actually die. He gets turned by drinking the blood of the vampire. So he'll become a vampire like Barlow. He won't become one of the mindless zombie-esque vampires, which I love. Like, I love this. You have a priest vampire to use later down the road, and he does.
I love when there's more complex vampire lore than just we're all so powerful and strong and alluring, and now we're it. That's it.
Yeah.
Like, it was fun to see how much he brought in, and how much, like, there's a moment at the end when they're trying to use the crucifix, that they've homemade crucifix to try to, like, ward off the vampire, and Barlow was like, don't you know it's about faith? Mm-hmm. You don't believe in what you're doing, which was such a good moment. Yeah, that's how he talks
Callahan out.
Yeah.
And that happens right after you see Billy, who's now I'm forgetting the doctor's name.
Matt.
Jimmy
basically makes one out of tongue depressors, but they believe and it works.
Yeah.
And then this priest, who should believe, who we know he doesn't.
He's even wearing one himself.
He's got an actual cross and it does nothing.
And oh, that was such a good
fun.
moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing I loved, especially since, like I said, I watched your Twilight episode, and it was fun for you guys to say, like, oh, Edward, he can eat garlic. Like, he can hang out in the sun. And in this one, it's like, okay, after you kill them, you cut their heads off, you bury them upside down, you stuff their mouths with garlic, you throw them in a place with moving water. Like, all these, like, all the lore brought together and being like, don't mess with it.
And
this is not silly.
There was a fun moment, too, when they're like, okay, I can get behind crucifix, I can get behind daylight hurting them. What's with the garlic? And someone's like, maybe they're allergic.
Yeah.
Which was like a fun moment of, oh,
yeah, it was
okay.
fun.
The rules are silly, but they still exist.
Yes.
And they change the way that you kill a vampire. So what I really like in a story is when a character has an obstacle to overcome, and there's specific steps they have to achieve, that they have to take to achieve that goal. So the vampires in this book, they do sleep during the day. Daylight hurts them. So that's when they hunt the vampires. And then at night, it's terrifying because Barlow is smart, maybe even smarter than a human, and he terrorizes the town while Ben and company try to hide and protect themselves and protect their loved ones.
I also enjoyed how they had to drive the stake into a heart with a secondary action.
Wasn't this easy thing?
Yeah, that makes your creatures so much more interesting because it actually makes the plot more interesting. Sorry, it doesn't help with your like tone of making the vampires feel cool and mysterious. Giving them steps actually takes away their mystery, but it makes the plot more interesting.
Yeah,
because the characters have to do something very specific. And it's challenging in order for them to kill the vampires.
And I mean, even just physically challenging, but emotionally to stab your love in the heart and then pound it through. Like,
it's traumatizing.
Oh gosh, that's awful.
Yeah.
I mean, all of it is, but...
Yeah.
Lovely.
So, I think with most Stephen King stuff... Oh, there's actually one scene I want to talk about.
Oh.
This is something that makes him so great, is that he can put scenes like these in his book that are so great and hilarious. We mentioned the bus driver at the beginning, who's like a bus driver Nazi. And he treats his kids horribly that get on board. At the end of the book, all of his kids are vampires. And they get on his bus.
By honking the horn.
And they wake him up early by laying on the horn.
So
and he
good.
wakes up with like
tennis paddle? What did he have?
Tennis racket.
Tennis racket. He's like, I'm going to beat these kids. And then he gets on the bus and it's filled with all these vampire kids.
So good.
I was like, yes, kill the bus driver. But the bus driver is also symbolically another interesting way to represent authority.
Yeah.
100%.
So it's so layered. It's very intentional with almost all of Stephen King's stuff. The ideas are great. Sometimes the execution can fall flat, but you can't deny just how talented he is.
Oh, the ending, I was like...
The ending was good on this one, I thought.
Compared to most Stephen King stuff, his endings are pretty abrupt. Okay. But this is better than most endings of his that I've read about.
So I'm going to talk about one of my favorite scenes, too. And I know we're probably getting close.
No, you're cool.
Another thing that Stephen King does, and this is another thing that I think even I miss because I've been reading some of the most recent Stephen King books in the last year and a half, I guess, kind of catching up. He doesn't do this as much anymore. But there's a scene in there with a father and a son who are farmers. I don't even know if they have names in the book. And he uses that scene right in the middle of the book as an allegory. And the farmer is talking about how hard it is to be a farmer and everything he does feels like it's going against him. And he's harrowing his field with his tractor and one of the blades of the harrow hits a rock that he had missed the year before. Like, that's a nice way to put it. Like, I should have seen this rock. I didn't throw it away. It breaks the blade. He has to stop the tractor. His son helps him hold up the thing while he replaces the blade. And the blades are very sharp. And the whole time he's talking about how everything fights against the farmer. Everything fights against man. It feels like all we do is work. And then his son, whose hands are oily from holding the tractor parts, accidentally drops the tractor. And the blade from the one next to the one that he fixed that's still sharp just grazes his arm and doesn't cut him. And he has this moment of clarity of like, but everything is wonderful.
Yeah.
Like, and he's like, talks about how great things come from the earth, and how he's, and that duality, once again, is the theme of the book. But those scenes just get cut now.
Yeah.
And it was so beautifully written. We don't know what happened to either of those boys. I would assume they're both vampires.
Yeah,
sure.
I feel like they have to be.
It's probably were.
Or it could have just been an allegory, and they weren't real characters.
Yeah.
But that's, again, that concept of abstraction. There's a Japanese concept of Ma, and I'm only going to bring this up because I have recently been reading about it and about Shadow of the Colossus and Ico, which are great games where it's like 90% of it is emptiness, but you fill in your own experiences, and then it makes those 10% moments of action so much more engaging.
Yeah.
And that scene where he takes time to explain that allegory is that concept of Ma, or nothingness. And you can fill in your own interpretation of what those scenes mean for the rest of the book, for the more important stuff that happens. It's very rare when a writer does that.
Yeah.
I would say Brandon Sanderson also does that. Just as a Brandon Sanderson fan, I have to say it. This is very similar style that Brandon Sanderson writes in. Multiple POVs, tons of different interstitial chapters where they feel like they mean nothing to the story. But if you're a world builder lover like me, then you love it. I didn't mean to make this a review about Brandon Sanderson.
No, that's okay. Like even the second to last chapter, it's like 4 hours long, and it's the whole chapter of them trying to kill the evil vampire. And the chapter begins with the Farmer's Almanac of October 5th. Here's the weather. Here's what it was. Perfectly pleasant day. And then it transitions to an old man who has a heart attack and dies. And the last sentence there is, that was the only natural death that happened on this day. And you're like, well, so everybody's going to die.
Yeah.
Oh, it's fantastic.
So good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Everything feels so intentional and planned. It's the type of book that you can read 3 times or more.
I would pick up so much more stuff if I read it again. I should.
I would too. Yeah. There was a lot of stuff that I missed, and I would like to come back to it. I found it perfectly enjoyable.
Yeah, me too. Other than the sexism stuff. Once it got scary, I was really hooked.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
Well, is this one of your favorite books, Dad?
It's one of my favorite Stephen King books. I'd say it's a top 5, which is a lot because he's written 60-something. It's probably a top 5 Stephen King book, but it's not one of my favorite books.
Would you recommend it?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Especially this time of year.
Yeah.
It's Halloween time. I'll recommend it to anybody who says, I love vampires, and they're wearing a Twilight shirt. I would recommend it to anyone like that.
Yes.
Yeah. Vampires can be interesting? Is this one of your favorite books?
Not one of my favorite books, but I really enjoyed it, and I would definitely recommend it to people.
Cool.
What about you?
No, it's not one of my favorites, but I would also recommend it.
I would give it a passing grade. You get a C+.
It's totally fair. Yeah. Totally fair.
I don't think I enjoyed it quite as much as either of you did. I enjoy it more now talking about it in retrospect.
That's what I was thinking too.
Yeah.
But in the moment, I was definitely like, this is a long book.
Yeah.
But I feel that way about most books that I read. But yeah, it's fun when you can review a book and after talking about it with someone who noticed things you didn't, you can appreciate it more. That's cool.
Yeah.
That's my favorite thing about books.
Yeah.
That's why we did the whole podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for listening. If you've made it this far, please leave a like. You obviously enjoyed the episode. You must have. Unless you're a hate watcher, then leave a dislike.
Oh, please. Give us another comment about how we have bad book opinions.
Yes, please. We love it. We live off it. Please leave a comment if you've read this book or if you've read any other Stephen King books that you'd like to recommend. He's got a big discography.
Next up, we have The Serpent and the Wings of Night for our Vampire Readathon.
Yeah. Only 2 more to go. You can join our Discord. There's a link down below where we can have discussions about the books that we're reading. And you can also find a calendar for the other books that we have to read for the rest of this month. So thank you all for watching.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.